Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of John. We're still in John chapter 20, looking at the first Easter, as John gives witness to the resurrection. Now, the Gospel of John places emphasis on the fact that Mary Magdalene was the first witness to the resurrection. He tells how she came to the tomb and discovered it was empty, and went and told Peter and John. It also says she was the first to see Jesus. And then in verse 18, Mary Magdalene goes to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." She told them that he had said all these things to her. So she has the honor, that distinction, that glory even, of being the very first witness to the resurrection. Now, it's interesting that the other gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, talk about the women who came to the tomb. For instance, Matthew talks about Mary Magdalene and the other Mary who came to the tomb that morning, probably meaning the mother of James and Joseph, as mentioned earlier in his gospel. And then Mark mentions that Mary Magdalene came along with Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and he also says Salome came, who is the mother of James and John, the disciples of Jesus. And Luke mentions that Mary Magdalene came to the tomb along with Joanna and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Luke says there were other women present as well. But John only mentions Mary Magdalene. So we know there were women, plural, who came to the tomb that morning. But all four accounts mention Mary Magdalene. They all mention Mary Magdalene because she was the first witness to the resurrection and has a place of distinction and honor in the Christian community. Now, we don't know that much about Mary Magdalene. We obviously know she was at the tomb. We also know she was at the cross on Friday. We know she was a disciple of Jesus. And we also know that earlier in her life, at some point, Jesus had delivered her from oppression. For instance, in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 9, it says, talking about Easter, when Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. So even Mark emphasizes that she is the first to bear witness to the resurrection of Jesus. He appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. At some point, Mary had experienced a great deliverance. She had been demonized. She had 7 demons, and Jesus had driven them out and restored her to wholeness. And she had become a disciple. I know we would be interested in more of the story of how that all came about, but we're not told. We're just simply told that she had experienced the great deliverance of the Lord, his saving power in her life, setting her free from oppression by evil. And she had become a disciple. And so we find her at the cross, yes indeed, but we also find her at the tomb on Easter morning. She is the first to give witness to the Lord. Now, actually, this gives it the ring of authenticity to the gospel accounts. Now, I say that because of this. In first century, the testimony of a woman was not accepted as legal testimony. I mean, women could tell what they had seen, but in terms of legal weight in the courts of that time, or in public opinion of that time, only a man's testimony counted. I say that to make this point. If the early Christians had made up the story of the resurrection, as some liberals say they did, some of the liberals say Jesus didn't really rise, the disciples just made it up, and as an example of his continuing influence. But anyway, if they had just made up the story of the resurrection, they would have had a man giving testimony. The fact that you had a woman being the first witness to the resurrection did not carry in first century any legal weight. So the fact that they all testify, all the Gospels testify to the fact that Mary Magdalene was the first witness, that's authentic. In other words, if you made it up, you would not have a woman be the testifier, you would have a man. But the fact that they all point to Mary Magdalene, who had been delivered from demon possession earlier in her life, that rings of authenticity. No one would make that up. They would only tell that if it's true, because of course it is true. Jesus did rise from the grave. He is alive. He is the living Lord. And Mary Magdalene was the first one to give witness to that wonderful reality. And so after experiencing the presence of the Lord, she goes to the disciples and she says, I have seen the Lord. What a great testimony. And that is the Easter witness of us all. We've experienced the risen Lord. We give witness to the risen Christ. Now, in tomorrow's session, we'll go on with the events of Easter. John is going to move to the evening of the first Easter, when Jesus appears to all of his disciples. But we'll look at that in tomorrow's session. So join us next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of John.